Just let me know when you do.
Yeah, we're live.
Okay, thanks, Joel. Hi, and welcome to the eighth and final conversation in the C Conversation series for Monsoon 2023. I'm Prasad Hanolkar. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Environment and Architecture. And I've been moderating the Monsoon series, which is titled To Inhabit with Care. So this, before we sort of begin the conversation, I just wanted to introduce what the C Conversation series is, and then introduce the speaker for today. So the conversation series is organized by C-City. C-City is an institutional extension of the school. So it was conceived in 2014, and it was thought of as this public platform for dialogue on architectural, social, and cultural issues pertaining particularly to the spatial environment that we produce and inhabit. So since 2014, every semester we've curated C conversations, which happens every fortnight, around a specific theme that resonates with our current times. So for this semester, we curated around the theme of care, and hence the title, To Inhabit with Care. So To Inhabit with Care is located in a context where, or in a world where everything seems uncertain, right? And uncertain in times of climate change, in terms of sort of an erasure of security systems for a majority of people, recurrent pandemics, sort of, an exposure to toxicity around the world, questions about, financialization of lives, deepening of xenophobia, but there's also a certain dominant financialization of health and a medicalization of care, right? So in uncertain times, when we want to think about care, how do we rethink care beyond this question of medicalization and financialization of health and care? That's sort of the question. So the idea was that how do we rethink care, but also how do we think with care or engage with care with others? So that was largely the premise within which this series was curated. This series is organized by C-City, but it's partially funded by the Urban Center of Mumbai. Urban Center was established in 2020, and it's a node for dialogue and ideation, as well as a space to carry out research on sustainable urban development. So they've been partially funding this conversation series over the past few years. So this is the last conversation, and I'm also excited and glad that it's being organized in a very different format. So it's a reading, and the reading has been curated by today's speaker, which is Shveta Sarda. So I'll just introduce Shweta. So Shweta is an editor and translator based in Delhi. She edited and translated one of the seminal books on cities, the Trickster City, or Delhi Sheher, which is writings about Delhi by 20 writers from different working class neighborhoods in Delhi, who were also associated with the Cyber Mohallas ensemble, which she's also was involved in working with them over the years. She's also translated books of the renowned writer and playwright Bisham Sani, and particularly his novels Basanti and Mansion. She's also co-edited the book Cyber Mohalla and edited the work Untimely. So she's also been involved in connections and stuff. sorry, this is something showing up. So she's also edited the book Untimely Calendar by the Rux Media Collective. So welcome, Shveta, and thanks for organizing this and curating the reader. And she's accompanied by a troop of C-City students who are from different years. So we have Eesha Pethe, if you just want to raise your hand and so people know who's who. Yes, Eesha Pethe, Tanisi. Tanisi, do you want to just, yeah. Gargi Somani, Rachit Somani, Gala, Vanshita Purwar, Lohitha Rao, and Shravani Wagh. Hi, and thanks for doing this and for joining us for this last session and for all the work that you put in over the days. So we have with us also Kush Patel, who's going to be responding to the reading. Yeah. So Kush is an architect scholar and a pedagogue who teaches at the Srishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology in Bangalore. At Srishti, Kush also heads the Postgraduate Arts Program in Technology and Change and stewards the Just Future Co-Lab. He's been teaching and researching around questions of critical digital humanities, around histories and futures of that are grounded in intersectional feminist and queer epistemologies. And also it has been working around questions of care within these frameworks of digital humanities and feminist and queer epistemologies. So he's going to be responding to the readings. Thanks, Kush, for joining us. We're glad that you were able to make it. Yeah. So the format is very simple. So we have the reading followed by a response from Kush, and then we'll open it up for a larger conversation and the question and answers if there are from the attendees. Yeah. So I'll hand it over to you, Shweta. Thanks a lot.
All of us wanted to suggest, thank you, Prasad. All of us wanted to suggest that we all try the gallery view for this session. And we'll just begin now. I want to begin by giving thanks. It's possible I started reading the texts I'm bringing here in 2001 or in 2007 or in 2015. I revisited them all 2 months ago towards the reading today to draw out fragments and bring them into a sequence, a relay, an argument. This month, the readers, 8 students at sea, and I met several times online, a total of about 8 to 10 hours, to read to one another from my developing draft. Each one has themselves chosen to read the texts and my annotations connecting them. In discussions in our meetings, we dwelled on their curiosities about and disagreements with individual texts, for each text holds many debates, and on agreements about inflections they express when placed in relay are read with the other texts. How the texts were read and argued and read out has folded into the shape of the reader being shared today. So while all texts have stayed, the order of placement of texts changed, they became longer or shorter, it sharpened the annotations. A shifting, multiplying shared I is a strength of collective reading. I want to thank Prasad Khanolkar for staying in and listening in each meeting, and for him suggesting gentle edits to the flow of this reader. Also, I read the Marathi book with him. To agree with a reader, or for a reader to agree with you, is not always the goal. To have an agile, generous reader is a pleasure. A shout out to the context at sea, which has, foremost in the last month, appeared to me as being open to an uncertain form in a public moment. My dear friends Prasad Shetty and Rupali Gupte have, before, extended warm invitations to me to share that which occupies my time and my mind. My thanks to Rupali for this invitation. For concerns of time, I will not go into that story. End of August 2015, a week from her having been in this world for 35 years, Sharma's status changed from a person to a person who needs active care. Within a week, she as if developed an allergy. One could smile about it and attribute it to the urgent, massive resetting of a cellular system that was underway, and because of which it starts to respond differently to different proteins, expressing this response in unfamiliar ways. One response was to the notion that her partner was now her caregiver. It was eye-opening how many of her friends were caregivers to family members and friends, for in their generous, friendly visits, they talked about the toll it takes when a condition is chronic. And yet, the notion that she was now a taker of care, received from a giver of care, was unpalatable to her. This was not to underwrite the immensity of labor, seen, unseen, unequal, disparate, that persists in the world. But let's just say she was not charmed by the shift that was being gestured to in her life, a tilt, and she responded to it in the best way she knew how, by the projecting of a large affect. "I'm the receiver," she would exclaim. "I am delightful." 8 years on, the condition persists. Now, as then, not to the receiving or giving of care, but to those who wield power through the naming of that effort which we bring into this world, setting up terms in which we should then narrate ourselves. We stumble into them and find ourselves caught in their force fields, alive suddenly to the conflicts that crisscross everything that is supposed to soothe. Even at that time, she was astonished and sometimes confused by the sudden proximities this entailed. For instance, it had never occurred to her that a diagnosis would open up a question to others about her way of life. If she should now disappear from the life she was making, disappear into convalescence, and reappear on the other end once it was over. Once, listening to a talk on hospice care, she ached with sudden feeling of the impossibility many would have been faced with during the 80s in America, when one in a same-sex couple battled end of life in a hospital, only to have his partner of years disempowered in the medical encounter of any sane decisions. This was not her history, not her story, not her condition, and yet here it was, one of the feelings that came to stay in the camp of her illness beside her body under treatment. I think my attendant would like this expression, the camp of her illness. I find he always responds with great feeling when someone arrives upon an expression or insight that is tenurial in nature. It feels right to him. Earlier this year, when I was speaking with him with great feeling about how translation, my primary practice, is a tenurial practice, you don't own the text, you move into it not to own it, and you do things to it, make it move, make it grow, make it gather resonances and meanings in travels, he was most moved. I like it.
We invite you to a listening of what is to come next as a dispute, brought into an encampment, this reader, to nudge away from custodianship as a form of care to a practice of attending to. Listen to it as a story. And just as all good stories begin in time, once upon a time or a long time ago, so does this one. So let us begin in an arc of time by marking a date.
23rd September 2015. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault is the world's insurance against worst-case scenarios. Since the seed vault opened in the far north of Norway in 2008, hundreds of thousands of seeds have been deposited into the facility situated in the Arctic wilderness, a rainy day fund for the world's food supply. And it turns out that one country already needs to make a withdrawal. The seeds are a backup copy of crops around the globe, so that if something truly terrible happens in the future, like a disease, drought, or war, a country can rebuild its food supply. For Syria, that unfortunate future is now. The civil war there has devastated the country, causing refugees to flee towards Europe in thousands. The country's infrastructure is unstable at best, and its own seed bank was forced to leave the country to prevent it from being utterly destroyed.
मैं नहीं उठूंगी। गठरी लिहाफ में दुबकी बुदबुदा देती। नहीं, अब तो मैं नहीं उठूंगी। इस वाक्य ने उन्हें हिला दिया और बच्चे और जिद करने लगे। वे डर जो गए, हाय उनकी अम्मा। पापा गए और उसे भी ले गए। सोती मत रहिए, उठिए। सोती रहती है, पड़ी रहती है, आंखें मुड़े पीट करके कानाघोशी चलती। पापा थे तो हरदम उनकी देखरेख में फुर्तीली, मुस्तैद, लाख थकान हो तो भी चूर चूर होते जाने के चूरे में व्यस्त, जीवंत। खींचती, खफाती, संभालती, फंकानती, सांस पर सांस चलाती, क्योंकि सभी की सांस उसी से चलती, सभी की सांस वो चलाती। और अब कि नहीं उठना मुझे, जैसे पापा ही जीने का मकसद थे। गए तो गया। नहीं अम्मा नहीं, बच्चे हट करने लगे। बाहर देखो धूप खिली है, उठो उठाओ छड़ी टंगी है, चूड़ा खाओ मटर पड़ी है, पेट बहा है राई फंका। नहीं मैं नहीं, नहीं नहीं, माँ कुनमुनाना जाती, थकी बेचारी अकेली हारी। उसे उठाओ, उलझाओ, उसका मन लगाओ। अटूट दया उनमें गंगा जी की तरह बहती और माँ की पीठ पर लहर जाती। अब नहीं, माँ चीखना चाहती, उसका मरा मरा स्वर निकलता। क्या माँ ने सोचा होगा कि उसे झिलाने की बच्चों की कोशिश उसे दीवार में घुसा रही थी? या ऐसा था? कमरे की तरफ पटचाप आती और वो पीट कर लेती, दीवार में सिमटने लगती, मरती जाती। आंख नाक बंद, कान थप, मुंह सिला, मन सुन, अरमान निराज, पखेरु उड़ उड़। पर बच्चे भी ढीठ, जुटे रहते। पीठ पर आंख नाक कान उगा दे कैसे? पाटी बाहर दस्त की कहकर, वही किचकिच कचायन, वही चूल्हा लकड़ी आटा, वही पोतड़े साफ करना। नहीं नहीं, वो दोहराती जाती, किसी पड़यंत्र की तरह नहीं, बल्कि यंत्र की तरह। उबा हुआ यंत्र, अफारा हुआ तंत्र। किसी चीज में अपने को सिर्फ न करने की काहिली में वह फिर बेऊर्जा बुदबुदाती। नहीं नहीं, नहीं नहीं, अब तो नहीं उठूंगी। चंद शब्द जिसमें बच्चे घबरा रहे थे कि मां मर रही थी। अभी नहीं उठूंगी। कि डर और मर से कौन खेल रहा था? यांत्रिक ये शब्द तांत्रिक हो चले और मां कह वह रही थी, पर वह था कुछ और, या हो गया। इच्छा या बेमकसद लीला। नहीं नहीं, मैं नहीं उठूंगी। अब तो 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 मैं नहीं ही उठूंगी।
Dadi's refusal, nahi, is to the new time created in the care of and the custodianship of the family. Did she think that her children's efforts to make her live were pushing her into the wall? As we know from the phrase in the custody of, custody is a word of care. If care is primarily to know what is in your custodianship and ask for a different orientation to the world, custodianship undergirds ways in which territories are produced, imagined, and maintained.
The power of the custodian. The first job of the custodian's office was to identify evacuees and take control over their properties. Once a property was vested in this office, a custodian could function literally as a de facto owner of the property with powers to run businesses of the evacuee. Appoint a manager to take care of the property, undertake repairs and construction, pay taxes on behalf of the evacuee, institute, defend, and continue any legal proceedings on behalf of the evacuee. Take control of the entire firm if the person declared as evacuee held 51% shares, evict tenants staying on the property before it being declared as evacuee, and even sell the property vested in it with the approval of the custodian general. The custodian's office was also empowered to lease out any property declared as evacuee to a displaced person. Though the ownership rights legally still remained with the original evacuee owners, and the property was given only on temporary lease, it became nearly impossible for original owners to regain their property once it was declared as evacuee or allotted to a displaced refugee. The Administration of Evacuee Property Act, 1950.
It is the capacity of the custodian to redistribute material life, to remake. In the years following the partition, the custodian's office was empowered to enter homes and workshops, boardrooms and bedrooms, neighborhoods and markets, marking, seizing, holding, and redistributing. Delhi, the city I grew up in, was remade through this custodianship, recasting apasi, that which we make with each other, into a new language. This remaking is all-pervasive and present in its urban fabric.
जहां पना The city that she walks in is the fourth medieval city of Delhi, established in the 14th century by Muhammad bin Tughlaq. It offers another story. From delirious readings 2 years ago, a story formed in her mind about two kinds of peers, the state absorbing and the state repelling. Her sources misplaced, she remembered peers who lived outside the city, perhaps by water bodies, unmindful of the sovereign and with their own following, and to whom the king must still pay regard owing to their popularity. In all likelihood, this is the story about Nizamuddin Aulia and Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, Muhammad bin Tughlaq's father, who built Tughlaqabad. The story goes that at the same time as he was building his fortified city, Nizamuddin Aulia began the construction of a bauli, a stepwell, and there ensued what we could call a dispute over labor. Popular accounts are that the men who worked on the fort walls during the day worked on the stepwell by night, which angered the king, and he made sure that there was no oil for the lighting of lamps for work to be carried out at night. Here, a historian put things in perspective. The dominant self-representation of the ruler, carried in his epigraphs, coins, and eulogistic histories, portrayed him as the protector of the Sharia, responsible for constructing schools, mosques, and other public monuments where Muslims could be taught and socialized into accepting an orthopraxis aligned to a scripturalist interpretation of Islam. But he was the military commander. He administered the Iqta, tracts of land assigned to soldiers, officers, and nobles, and so he could not guide his subjects on matters concerning morality and law. For that, people looked to the pious in their congregations, ascribing them with honorifics such as Buzurg, a great man, a learned elder. It was through the acknowledgement of the local congregation that the ulama and the Sufi sheikhs achieved a respectable status, and the state ignored these local sentiments only at its peril. On their own part, the royal instituted the office of the Sheikh-ul-Islam, a nebulous figure, who seems to have been quite generally a guide, an adjudicator, a keeper of the moral conscience of Muslims under his charge. He was a powerful appointee of the Delhi Sultan and was the cause of much public harassment of the Sufis in the capital. Yet, at the same time, the title of Sheikh-ul-Islam was also an honorific conferred by residents of a town to a locally venerated individual. It was these informal political figures, pious Sufi sheikhs, who were referred to as Sheikh-ul-Islam and who commanded real authority rather than the Qazi.
There is the informal pious Sufi sheikh, one of the many in the longue durée urban congregations the Sultan must reign over. And there is the Qazi, the state-appointed sheikh. So then it is from here that she remembered her state-repelling and state-absorbing peers. The conflict is not between two kinds of sheikhs, but between the calls and interpretations of values between the state-repelling sheikh and the Sultan.
Vilayat. In South Asia, it means foreign, vis-a-vis British, but everywhere else in the world, authority, dominion, guardianship, supervision. The Sultan could recruit as objects of his bounty and clients of his patronage, Sufis with lesser claims than the great sheikhs. From the point of view of the Sultan, the failure of the sheikh to perform such gestures might constitute a threat to his authority because of the visible independence of the sheikh from that authority and the possibility that the sheikh's khanaqah might provide a refuge and a rallying point for dissidents and plotters against it. It's in this context that we read Amir Khusru on Nizamuddin Aulia, given the title The Sultan of Sheikhs by his followers. An emperor in a fakir's cell, a refuge of the world for the heart of the world, a king of kings without throne or crown, with kings in need of the dust of his feet.
Jahanpana conjoins two words, Jahan, the world, and Panah, refuge. Jahanpana, refuge of the world, empire of many cities as one city being authored by its ruler. And we have as well a peer in a tense relationship with the Delhi Sultanate, a conflicting peer, also offering refuge to the world. It's not to the overlapping ideas and values of authority, but the overlapping and contending ideas of Panah, of refuge, to which we here become drawn.
Hello. Important announcement. Listen carefully. An innocent girl of 4, crying for long, not answering questions. Take her from here. Wearing a green frock, two ponytails. Just as every announcement distinguishes itself from the Azan, so did this announcement. As soon as he heard the first few words of this announcement, Chawabai stopped mincing meat and raising a blood-soaked finger to his lips, he turned to the children standing near him. Shh! This little girl is about 4 or 4.5 years old. This girl has been standing near the mosque next to Bhai Bhurewala's biryani shop, crying for a long time now. Whoever she may be, please come and take her from here. Everyone is urged to pay the utmost attention to this announcement. The same thing was repeated over and over. Noon turned to evening, and it was 4 in the evening. No one came to claim the child. The veranda of the mosque where ablutions are performed before prayer was filled with people. The little girl sat on a chair surrounded by many young children, and the adults gathered a little distance away. Give the girl to the one who doesn't have children, someone who will care for her as her own, someone said. Hand her to the police. They'll return her to wherever she is from, a woman suggested. Molana Sahib replied softly, that she's not from here is clear, because she doesn't understand what we say to her. She said something in Bengali which we couldn't understand. If we hand her to the police, who knows what they will do with her, where she will land up. A man said that there was a rally at the Ram Leela grounds this morning. It's possible that the girl got left behind. The whispering intensified. Array, the rally has left. Didn't her parents look for her? Someone has abandoned her. Standing at Nabil's shore, Shanu burst out. Let Zinat Appa take her. Sitara repeated Shanu's suggestion. Yes, let Zinat Appa keep her. Someone yelled. No, she won't keep her. Hand her to the police. Keep the police out of it. This was Zinat Appa's voice. I will take her. Everyone turned in surprise. I will find out where she's from. I will make sure she returns. Wearing a sweater, her hair loosely folded and held together with a claw, Zinat Appa walked towards the scene, medicines in one hand. Her friend Shaida said, Zinat, how will you? Zinat Appa replied calmly, we will see.
Since most of us are in Bombay, the city she once studied in, we often have a narration that draws this living breath of Panna lived in Mumbai, one generation before.
The attacks on 11 November 2001 in the US reached Wahid Deen Mohammad Sheikh's slum cluster home in Mumbai about 2 weeks later. The 21 Wahid taught at a government-aided school run by a trust and had a future to look forward to. He was among the most educated in that corner of the Ghatkopar slums on the eastern fringes of the city, and his steady monthly income could now ward off the persistent assault of poverty on the family. Poverty was the pivot of their family history and even of the religion that Wahid was born into. His father had run away as an 8-year-old from an impoverished Hindu family in Uttar Pradesh after his own father bet him up badly. The angry boy made his way to the local railway station and got on a train that brought him to Bombay. In this bewildering metropolis, he was a draft without a penny to his name or any place to call home. After a few days of wandering, the child ended up at a dargah. Here he met a tall woman dressed in a wrap around skirt and kurta, with wind-blown open hair, furiously smoking cigarettes when she was not praying. She gave the famished boy water and food and asked him to go back home. The boy said she would not. Do you want to stay with me? She asked. He readily agreed and moved into her home in a slum in Kalyan. She fed him and took care of him like her own child. Over time, she adopted two more orphans and their family grew. One day, a man also moved in. Together, they became parents to the three children, but the two never married. Eventually, the family shifted to a bigger slum in Ghatkopar. Look at them, Wahid says of his parents. I'm still finding it surprising that they got married. My mother is tall, unlike him. Her name is Mumtaz. He smiles. Mumtaz was just 13 when she got married in 1977. A year later, their eldest son was born, and they named him Wahid, one of the 99 names of the Prophet, meaning unique, peerless. Wahid and his siblings called their adoptive grandparents Dada and Dadi. Years later, when Wahid watched actress Pooja Bhatt in the song Mainu Ishq Da Lagya Robe, she reminded him of a photo back home, his grandmother in a wrap around skirt and kurta, her open hair flying in the wind. Dadi passed away a few months after Wahid was born. However, the big frame photo of her remained in the house. Before setting out for any exams or any important events, Wahid and his brothers took her blessings at the photo.
They tell me to go home and wait for my end. I fear going back home, jumping into the image they've created for me. I'm on the bed, barely breathing. I deform it, the image. It struggles between realities. They want to impose theirs because otherwise their ground becomes cracked.
We take a detour here, a detour back to refusal, a descent to a certain form, regime of care. Alina Popa, Romanian artist, was diagnosed with what her friend calls a hopeless illness, and of which she died 2 years later in 2019 when she was 36. These fragments are from her writing, Disease as an Aesthetic Project, and the drawings on the screen she made with her eyes closed, notebook on her chest. Our thanks to Arshad Hakim, artist, for sharing this text in January this year.
When something intimately changes your body, your possibilities to move, your dynamic with the outer world, your identity for many people, your limits as what you can bear, that thing forces you into inner transformation. I hate the thing, I love the thing. The thing forces me over my edges. I cannot squeeze it out of me. I cannot directly influence it. I can only take it as a challenge to my rational mind, to what I have been, to my own limitations. It has grown more than I have ever thought it could. It became big and ugly and part of me. I have to live and love myself with my monster. Realization. I have never trusted my body and its responses. We are taught so by education. Fever needs to be kept at bay. Symptoms have to be read by specialists. You don't own your body. It's like a foreign coat you have to take care of and be aware of it. Look for signs, gather evidences. You are outside your body. You analyze it scientifically, but what does this mean? It means that you're placing it in the scriptures written by strangers who are afraid of the wonder of reality and want to restrict its vastness to a few predictable scenarios. The body is real, but what we think about it is fiction. Medical views are fictions imposed on us by modernity and capitalism. This is a consensus fiction. How you regard the body, how you name, determine how you act upon it and how it acts back. We are free, and the body actually calls for individual factions or fictions that give it trust and freedom. Perspective creates reality. To change the standard perspective is almost impossible. It cannot be done mentally. It needs different practices. To practice ways to interact with the world that give back reality its multiplicity.
25th November. What do I feel reading the poems of Ashraf Fayyad? The question of life always accompanies the appreciation of expression. In November 2015, she read about poet Ashraf Fayyad. Born in 1980 into a stateless family of Palestinian origin, sentenced to death by the state in Saudi Arabia where he lived, to be executed for apostasy for his collection of poems, Instructions Within. I didn't do anything that deserves death, he said. This evoked an intense international campaign, including readings of his poems by poets, and the sentence was subsequently commuted to a prison sentence. His poems pose for us a moment of pause to think the uninhabitable when extraction of life from life, of earth from earth, makes refuge an impossibility. Petroleum is harmless, except for the trace of poverty it leaves behind. On that day, when the faces of those who discover another oil well go dark, when life is blown into your heart to extract more oil off your soul for public use, that is the promise of oil, a true promise. The end. He's got no right to walk, however, or to swing, however, or to cry, however. He's got no right to open the window of his soul, to renew his air, his waste, and his tears. You too tend to forget that you are a piece of bread. My grandfather stands naked every day, without banishment, without divine creation. I have already been resuscitated without a godly blow in my image. I am the experience of hell on earth. Earth is the hell prepared for refugees.
Then we changed. Everything changed. It takes a lot of work to understand this. And also, there's an inability to speak out. I'm a biologist. My dissertation was on the behavior of bees. I spent 2 months on an uninhabited island. I had my own bees nest there. They took me into their family after I spent a week hanging around. They wouldn't let anyone closer than 3 meters, but they were letting me walk up next to them after a week. I fed them jam of a match right into the nest. Our teacher used to say, "Don't destroy an anthill. It's a good form of alien life." A bee's nest is connected to the entire forest, and I gradually also became a part of that landscape. A little mouse would come running up and sit on my sneakers. He was a wild forest mouse, but he already thought I was a part of the scene. I was there yesterday. I'd be there the next day. After Chernobyl, there was an exhibit of children's drawings. One of them had a stork walking through the field and then under it. No one told the stork. Those were my feelings too, but I had to work. We went around the region collecting samples of water, earth, and taking them to Minsk. Her assistants were grumbling. We were carrying hot cakes. We had no defense, no special clothing. You would be sitting in the front seat, and behind you, the samples were just glowing. They had protocols written up for burying radioactive earth. We buried earth in earth. Such a strange human activity.
What are the protocols? How does a body disclose to another body that its cells are not in order? It's not so straightforward. It is where we learn to be respectful to opacity. To attend is distinct from being attentive to. To attend brings us into an acute awareness of the spectrum of our opacities.
I met Rajesh, a 29-year-old man who had been battling chronic myelogenous leukemia since his teenage years. Rajesh rented a small makeshift roof on the roof of the house of his paternal relatives. To reach his room, we had to walk up a narrow snacking staircase that took us through the lower floors. His family's greetings to us were perfunctory. They were not keen on Rajesh having visitors.
Arriving at Rajesh's room, I saw how its walls were bare but for two pictures, one of a Hindu deity, Vishnu, and another of his parents who had died in a road accident when he was a teenager. Rajesh had contracted cancer soon after his parents' death, while he was working at a chemical factory on the outskirts of the city. The little money they had left him and the wages he had saved were spent in the early months of his treatment. His paternal kin had taken him in, but refused to extend any care.
In the early days after his diagnosis, his family's resentments saw to Rajesh's isolation in a small, barely covered veranda of the house. Yet his will to live was strong. He would undertake a difficult journey to Ames in the early morning and make himself available for consultations and treatment. Hospital policies at Ames dictated that, given the debilitating effects of cancer therapies, patients must always be accompanied by a family member or attendant. To circumvent this requirement, Rajesh would sign his patient forms twice, once under his own name and once again after leaving the ward and returning in disguise to sign as his own attendee.
Rajesh's family had hidden his diagnosis from their extended kin and neighbors, ensuring their own protection from accusations of neglect. Even if it was not their intent, this arrangement benefited Rajesh. He believed if the neighbors found out about his disease, they would ostracize him, which not only would result in further isolation, but also exacerbate his financial duress. At the time, Rajesh was earning the supplementary money he needed for his treatment by running errands for many families in his neighborhood. Rajesh was convinced that if they found out about his cancer diagnosis, they would shun him and he would lose the only income he had. I asked whether it might help if his neighbors found out that his family was neglecting to care for him. Would that perhaps shame his kin into extending him some support? Rajesh was not sure that this would be the outcome of his diagnosis becoming public. He suspected that his neighbors might side with the family rather than with him, sympathizing with the family's misfortune in having to take care of an unwelcome invalid.
One way to understand and examine Rajesh's instance on concealment would be to look for its cause, asking about the cultural beliefs that led to its practice. Indeed, public health writings about cancer non disclosures in India focus on the stigma associated with the disease, offering up a typology of cultural misunderstandings about the disease that are believed to contribute to this stigma. For example, many physicians and health experts identify beliefs about cancer that it is contagious, a punishment for a past sin, or a death sentence, as explanations for why patients are stigmatized and feel the need to conceal their diagnosis. Yet, while such beliefs might well contribute to stigma, this explanation leaves out an important aspect of concealments that primarily interest me here: the prior social worlds within which concealments and disclosures unfold. That is, while practices of concealment might certainly have something to do with cultural beliefs about the disease etiologies, its consequences and distribution take shape in relation to present social vulnerabilities. Put differently, even as public health scholarship is preoccupied with correcting false beliefs about contagion and moral disorder, neither Rajesh nor his family ever offered such casual explanations for their desire to conceal.
When I asked him once why he thought cancer evinced such strong and negative reactions, Rajesh shrugged inconclusively. But when we talked about another cancer patient in the same neighborhood who also kept the disease secret, Rajesh remarked that he did not think disclosure would have the same devastating effect for that person that it would for him. The other person he talked about was the head of his household, had a secure income, and had access to officials who could help him obtain state financial aid. The consequences of a forced or unintentional disclosure to the wrong person or at the wrong time would be quite different for the two patients.
Deeper in time, in Delhi, we listened to some silences. Bubbly Rai, one of the writers of Trickster City, from which we read earlier, once observed about a phenomenon that is देखने में हाँ, बोलने में ना. Yes seen, but left unspoken. It signals a different relationship with opacity, one's own, of one's time, cities, points of focus and attention, arguments, fictions. One cannot move out of opacities. One has to live in and appreciate the varying densities and illuminations in which one has to move. With someone obscures the self and sometimes help obscure the self. Following bubbly rhyme, opacity produces a doubleness. A person is there but not there. A place is there and not there. A life is there, not there.
Ravinder Kaur writes, Sham Singh was never a part of these discussions, even though he would regularly supply us with tea. He would sit down on the ground some distance away from us. He was always there listening to what was being said, but never intervening with his own stories. His low rank in the official hierarchy did not allow him to participate in such seemingly informed and authoritative debates. When one day I expressed my wish to interview Sham Singh and possibly visit his neighborhood, I encountered clear disapproval and animosity from within the regular discussion group. The reaction was not completely unsurprising because my talks with Sham Singh threatened to raise him to the same level as them.
Ravinder Kaur continues. Sham Singh could sense the disapproval and was hesitant to talk to me. On my part, I decided not to pursue the matter any further so as to prevent any complications that could arise for him at his workplace. We kept a distance from each other from then on. As a result, I could never gain any information about the location of the untouchable refugee colony where he lived. A vital clue was gained and immediately lost. The most positive outcome was that Sham Singh's presence and silence pointed to the gaping blanks in the popular partition history. These blanks needed to be filled in immediately if one were ever going to sketch the full canvas of partition movement and resettlement. On the other hand, Shamsing symbolized the silent of aberration within that matter narrative, which was always present but never publicly visible or audible. The silent figure in the background was now threatening the grand narrative itself by merely suggesting that its story to be heard by others. The story was never heard because the dominant figures in this drama expressed their disapproval at the proposed intrusion. Shyam Singh continued to be an aberration whose experiences had to be kept out of their story. It had never belonged to him, and he had obviously never offered to participate in it. He withdrew his offer to take me to his neighborhood, but as silently. Now the task before me was harder than before because, on the other hand, I had become aware of Shyam Singh's presence in the events of partition migration, and on the other, I had no clue how to trace an entire group of people in a burning city like Delhi, which was home to at least 14 million people at the time of my fieldwork. Ironically, it was the documents from the ministry that I was originally seeking that gave me a clue to the possibility of finding the untouchable refugee settlements in Delhi.
She further argues, it was clear that my question about the migration journey came as a surprise to them and that they had never considered themselves a part of the larger partition discourse, even though they had gone through more or less the same political circumstances as others had. They were now a part of current Dalit politics in a variety of ways. Ragharpura had been a place where Kanshi Ram, the founder of Bahujan Samaj Party, had started the Bahujan movement in the early 1970s.
When are you going to paint the halos? What halos? The next morning, the sky remained grey and dark, and the air was suffocating. A huge storm was building somewhere in the South China Sea. Strong winds swept every movable thing in the streets. The uncollected wooden frames and canvases were scattered about like dried leaves. With his wife's help, Li Bing had almost finished the four figures as well as part of the rocky landscape. By evening, he was working on the chubby body of baby Jesus. In fact, I doubted if he knew the baby was Jesus. Would it change anything though, if he learned who was who in this image? I didn't want to interfere. Instead, I just observed the way he painted Jesus's arms. The two raised fingers of the left hand, a characteristic Leonardo gesture. Li Bing slowed his pace down. His brush hesitated and made a subtle movement here. The dusky light descended, bringing cool breezes into the stifling studio. I can finish the background details tonight, then it can dry tomorrow. I nodded and continued to film him working. But when I looked closer at the painting, I saw that neither Mary nor Jesus had a halo around their head. So I reminded Li Bing, when are you going to paint the halos? What halos? The circle of golden light around their heads. I pointed to Mary and Jesus. You know, the thing a saint would usually have. Staring at his work, Li Bing looked confused. Then he took his phone from the stand and studied the image carefully. Ah, halos. He was exasperated. I didn't see them until now. The picture is so small on my phone. He put down his phone and looked again at his work. Hesitantly, he said, do you really think we need to add the halos? I mean, everything is great on the painting, but halos, they make the picture look amateurish. No one has a halo. People would think that was naughty graffiti from my son. I didn't object to his view on halos. He had let me film whatever I wanted. That was more important than adding two halos to the picture. In the middle of our conversation, rain had started spraying through the half-opened windows. A paper napkin blew onto my camera lens.
In his doctoral thesis, the scholar Kiran Kumhar dissolves the halo of nobility and invincibility that formed around doctors in our unequal society of intricate hierarchies, sedimented and inferment. He compels us to think why it is that the training in, practice of, and the conversation around medicine is yet to acknowledge and address that doctors have to learn how to attend to those who, in their social world, they find difficult to consider their own.
Like a screaming emotion that can cause the very ground on which you're standing to shift. Nilofer writes about hospitals in the book Trickster City. My mother had introduced me to this corner of the city as if it were a place to which people go to spend the last few moments before they die.
Chloroform by Arun Limai is a book in Marathi from 1978 about medical malpractice, which comes to us via Kiran Kumhar. This book has not been translated into other languages, and if one were to share its contents with doctors today, no doubt they would be disturbed, but also say that it is not an unfamiliar terrain. But there are decent doctors out there too. This is also what Limai ends his book with. The fragment that we will now read to you is one we found in the book that speaks to doctors looking at one another within the hierarchies of their own discipline.
मी पुढे सर्जन झालो खरा, पण माझ्या वडिलांची इच्छा मी ॲनेस्थेटिस्ट व्हावे ही होती. कारण एका वर्षात डिप्लोमा मिळत असे व त्यावेळी ॲनेस्थेटिस्ट कमी होते. ॲनेस्थेटिस्ट म्हणून काम करताना काही फायदे असतात. निरनिराळ्या सर्जन्सचे कौशल्य बघायला मिळते. एखाद्या अवघड शस्त्रक्रियेच्या प्रसंगी जेव्हा सर्जनची हबेलंडी उडते, तेव्हा ॲनेस्थेटिस्ट शांतपणे पेशंटच्या डोक्याच्या बाजूस बसून ती पाहत असतो. कधी कधी अडचणीच्या प्रसंगी उपयुक्त सूचनाही देतो. वास्तविक संकटावेळी जे बरोबर असतात त्यांच्या आपापतः मैत्री निर्माण होते. परंतु सर्जन ॲनेस्थेटिस्ट यांचे संबंध मात्र या पद्धतीचे नसतात. उलट एका प्रकारचा बोचरा खवटपणा या संबंधात आढळतो. कदाचित यामागे काही निराळी कारणे असतील. स्पेशालिटी प्रॅक्टिस असूनही त्या मानाने पैसे जास्त मिळत नाहीत. शिवाय पेशंट सर्जनचेच उपकार मानतो, ॲनेस्थेटिस्टला ओळखत सुद्धा नाही. अर्थात त्याच्यात थोडी जबाबदारी ॲनेस्थेटिस्टवर येते. कारण भारतात विशेषतः खाजगी प्रॅक्टिसेसमध्ये भूल देण्याआधी व भूल दिल्यानंतर पेशंटला तपासण्याची पद्धत उपवादानेच ॲनेस्थेटिस्ट पाळतो. त्यामुळे पेशंट त्याच्या ताब्यात असतो तेव्हा गुंगीत असतो व भूल उतरून शुद्धीत येईपर्यंत ॲनेस्थेटिस्ट घरी गेलेला असतो. तेवढाच वेळ काम करून सर्जन खोऱ्याने पैसे ओढत असल्याचे ॲनेस्थेटिस्ट डोळ्यांनी पाहत असतो. त्यातूनही सर्जनबद्दल असूयेची भावना बाळगत असतो. पुष्कळदा स्वेच्छेने त्याने ही लाईन घेतलेली नसते, तर परिस्थितीमुळे त्याला ती पत्करावी लागते. सर्जन न बनता जे डॉक्टर ॲनेस्थेटिस्ट बनतात त्यांच्या बाबतीत मग या असूयेत भरच पडते. वास्तविक भूल देणे हे मोठ्या कौशल्याचे काम आहे. कारण सर्जिकल ॲनेस्थेशियाच्या स्टेजपर्यंत पेशंटला न्यायचे व परत शुद्धीवर आणायचे म्हणजे मृत्यूच्या दारापर्यंत नेऊन परत आणण्यासारखे असते. ॲनेस्थेटिस्टची साधी चूक म्हणजे रोग्याला सरळ स्वर्गाच्या अगर नरकाचा मार्ग मोकळा. सर्जनने चूक केलीच तर ती पुष्कळदा सुधारण्यासारखी असते. बरं, रोगी बोलत नाही, त्यामुळे ॲनेस्थेटिस्टला स्वतःचे डोळे नीट उघडून ठेवून सतत जागरूक राहावे लागते. कधी कधी साध्या गोष्टीतूनही प्रचंड उत्पात घडतो व पेशंट मरतो की काय अशी परिस्थिती निर्माण होते. पेंटोथॉल नावाचे औषध शिरेतून दिले की पेशंटला झोप लागते व तो बेशुद्ध होतो. गळवे कापण्यासाठी छोटी छोटी ऑपरेशन्स अशा प्रकारची भूल देऊन करण्याची पद्धत आहे. मी ॲनेस्थेशिया पोस्ट करत असताना तोंडात गळू असलेली एक केस आली. वास्तविक हे औषध अशा प्रकारच्या ऑपरेशन्समध्ये वापरू नये असे शिकवलेले असते व पुस्तकातही स्वच्छ लिहिलेले असते. गळू कापणारा डॉक्टर हे ज्युनियरच होता. त्याचे ज्ञानही माझ्या इतपतच. मी भूल देण्यासाठी या औषधाचा वापर केला व परिणाम व्हायचा तोच झाला. गळू कापल्यावर तोंडातील पू घशामार्गे खाली उतरून श्वासमार्गात जाऊन श्वासमार्ग चोंदला. पेशंट स्पॅझममध्ये गेला. माझ्या व पेशंटच्या सुदैवाने माझ्या रजिस्ट्रार बाजूच्याच खोलीत होता. मसल रिलॅक्संट, सक्शन सेट व ट्यूब जागेवर होती म्हणूनच केवळ पेशंटचा जीव व माझी नोकरी दोन्ही वाचले.
Where Bubbly Rai and Ravinder Kaur talk to that, which is always present but never publicly visible or audible, Kiran Kumbar speaks to the often spoken, clear but misheard common understanding in the doctor-patient relationship. From it, and within the paradigm of the state-backed biomedical infrastructure, he brings in a multiplicity of sources to discuss mainstream, negligent, novel, exploitative, deprofessionalized, and also dissenting doctors.
JAMK, the Comprehensive Rural Health Project. Introduction. We have overcome. May 1988. In a huge conference hall in Washington, D.C., over 1,000 participants listened with rapt attention to Muktabai Kool, a village health worker from JAMK, India. The listeners include officials from WHO and UNICEF, ministers of health, health professionals, and representatives of universities from many parts of the world. Muktabai shares her experience of providing primary health care in a remote Indian village. She concludes her speech by pointing to the glittering lights in the hall. This is a beautiful hall, and the shining chandeliers are a treat to watch, she says. One has to travel thousands of miles and come to see their beauty. The doctors are like these chandeliers, beautiful and exquisite, but expensive and inaccessible. She then pulls out two wick lamps from her purse. She lights one. This lamp is inexpensive and simple, but unlike the chandeliers, it can transfer its light to another lamp. She lights the other wick lamp with her purse. Holding up both lamps in her outstretched hands, she says, I am like this lamp, lightening the lamp of better health. Workers like me can light another, and thus encircle the whole earth. This is health for all. The audience rises to its feet in a standing ovation.
The dissenting doctors were as enthusiastic about the idea of community health workers as they were critical about the idea of population control. The career trajectories of two such doctors, Mabel Arole and Rajnikant Arole, provides an illustrative example. After graduating from Christian Medical College at Vellore, they worked at a rural hospital in Maharashtra in 1960s. There they encountered a repetitive pattern of simple preventable disease, with villagers getting cured in the hospital and getting back into the community and later returning to the hospital with the same illness. They were convinced that a traditional curative-oriented hospital system does not penetrate the communities and does not see patients as a part of community in relation to the environment they live in, thus failing to meet the total need of the community. With this realization, they decided to gain additional medical and surgical skills abroad and then return to India to implement a better healthcare service program. They studied public health at Johns Hopkins University under the guidance of Carl Taylor, who also had worked in India. Back in Maharashtra in 1970, the Aroles decided to spearhead a community health program in and around the village of Jamkhed. They initially focused on providing curative services, including emergency care, as they were actively demanded by the villagers, hoping that the popularity and reputation gained through clinical work would act as a springboard for launching community health programs. Originally, the plan was to employ auxiliary nurse midwives, ANMs, as the most peripheral agent for community health, but soon they landed that it was difficult to recruit ANMs who would agree to settle in the village, and it was doubtful if villages would fully accept them as health guides. This realization spurred them to look for volunteers from within the community and eventually gave rise to the most extraordinary as well as the most well-known aspect of their healthcare project, the village health workers, VHWs. Most VHWs were women from marginalized communities with little formal literacy. In the Aroles' views, which differed substantially not just from the IMAs but also from those of Bhore and Mudaliar committees, the problems responsible for ill health in rural areas are not complex and do not need highly specialized and scientifically trained people for the solution. Dissenting doctors were receptive of the idea of CHWs in general, and some, like the Aroles, incorporated the idea into their own practice, even as the mainstream professional remained unconvinced.
To underline, there were dissenting notes within the Bhore Committee, the committee that drafted the blueprint of a modern public health delivery system in India in 1946. In the essay in 2010, Meenakshi Gautam and K.M. Shama Prasad write, the committee imposed the construct of a basic doctor, trained through 5.5 years of university education. It abolished the shorter licentiate qualification and disregarded systems of indigenous medicine, even though licentiates formed 2/3 of the country's registered doctors. The dissenting voices noted with anguish that since the new scheme would benefit only a section of the Indian population, public health over the remaining 4/5 to 1/2 of the country will atrophy. Licentiates used to go through 2.5 to 3 years of formal training. The debate about licentiates erupts time and again, with doctors going on strike against the very idea. As most present here are students of architecture, a corollary to this debate can be drawn from within the debates in architecture and urbanism. How could we understand cities, their make, the way they grow and morph, if we only understand architecture through the formal certification of university training?
Builders take iconic authorship, but there is another world of attending that keeps things going. The Hatfield crash. On October 17, 2000, the 1210 London to Leeds Express took the curve south of Hatfield at the highest permitted speed. The outer defective rail on the curve broke at some point after the locomotive and first 2 coaches passed over it. The rest of the train was derailed. 4 passengers died when the buffet car hit a steel pole which supports the overhead power line. Curves are by no means the only cause of damaged rails. The steel may contain flaws, little voids, which are difficult and sometimes impossible to detect by the human eye. Wheels which are out of shape and not perfectly circular can batter and dent the rail, like gauge corner cracking. This comes under the general heading of roller contact fatigue. The ground beneath can subside by an inch and twist the rail. The railhead can flake. The more I read about this subject, the more engineers I talk to, the more I saw rails in a new light. Not as simple and indestructible, the iron rod, but as complicated and vulnerable. Railway engineers have always seen them in this way, as a technology that requires constant vigilance. At a railway engineering exhibition in Birmingham, I met a retired permanent way engineer, Bill Armstrong, who spoke about the track as a living thing. Ballast could develop a memory. Rails always wanted to go back where they lived before. This was in the context of track relaying, the dangers of putting new line over old ballast furrowed by sleepers or old rails into new positions on a curve, where they would show signs of wanting to resume their original shape and need to be beaten back with hammers. Rails were always shifting, settling, creeping this way or that. As the chief permanent way engineer for a larger part of Yorkshire in the old coal district between Doncaster and Leeds, he had been required to walk every mile of his track twice a year. The main line and 3 tributary passenger branches, several colliery lines, a large freight yard, many dozens of miles on foot twice a year, peering at the rails. The inspectors under him walked every mile of track under their care at least once a month in turn. The sub-inspectors under them walked it at least once a fortnight. Then there were the permanent way gangers, laborers, who would also walk their particular stretch. In this way, every mile of the line was patrolled not less than twice a week. Passenger lines were inspected no fewer than 3 times, usually on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. We had a saying, Armstrong said, the uninspected inevitably deteriorates.
Many dozen miles twice a year, every mile once a month, every mile once a fortnight, and a walk in one's own particular stretch. We live between the aging and the new, amidst the trending to wear and tear, care and repair. The failure of infrastructure also comes from its falling into despair and disrepair from a failure of these rounds.
In hospitals too, there is the concept of rounds in the wards, durations of intersection of worlds where the consultant, attending doctor, junior doctors, nurses, ward boys, cleaners, patients, and their attendants come to be in a specific relationship. The ward is an important site. In the 2021 Malayalam language film Madhuram, set in a hospital, there isn't one single doctor. There are workers, attendants, family members, staff, patients. They make the ward. The ward is a world.
नर्स ने सुबह मुंह से ट्यूब निकाली। सिकंदर के पिता ने गीले कपड़े से मुंह पोंछा। बरामदे में चाय की ट्रॉली आई। वह 3 गिलास ले आया, एक मेरी तरफ बढ़ाया। न करती, उसने समझाया। 2 गुट पी लो प्रोफेसर साहब, नहीं तो देने वाले को दुख होता है। उसने पाइप से बंधी मेरी बाह देखी, चम्मच भर चाय मेरे मुंह में डाली। जीभ और होठ गर्मा गए। अच्छी लगी? हाँ, मैं सिर हिलाया। फिर हो पियो जी, सच्चे पातशाह की कृपा हो गई। आधा गिलास पीने के बाद सिर हिलाकर न करती। हरनाम सिंह से पूछा, बकरी घास क्यों खाती है? वह हक्का बक्का मेरी ओर देखता रहा। सामने बिस्तर पर लेटे शिमला वाले से पूछा, कोट पैंट टाई पहनकर लेटता है। डोंट नो, आई एम एन अकाउंट्स ऑफिसर। आस्क समथिंग अबाउट अकाउंट्स, यू आर ए स्टूपिड प्रोफेसर। सिकंदर चहका, मैं बताऊंगा। तो बता। वो बकरी को खाने के लिए मुर्गा जो नहीं देते। नर्स आई, थोड़ा घबराई हुई, कंघी से मेरे बाल पीछे किए, चादर ठीक की, खबर दी, बर्न्स के डॉक्टर चारी आ रहे हैं, ठीक से जवाब दे, गुस्सा करते हैं। डॉक्टर चारी कमरे में आए, उनके पीछे जूनियर डॉक्टर, वह बहुत लंबे हैं, बात करते हैं तो झुकना पड़ता है। चेहरा देख नीरज चौधरी की याद आ गई। कैसे है मिस्टर दीपक? तो केरल के डॉक्टर चारी भी अब हिंदी बोलते हैं। ठीक हूँ, मैं सिर हिलाया। हमसे बात करना अच्छा नहीं लगता? बोलकर बताइए। ठीक हूँ। अवनीत शर्मा ने बताया, कभी शिकायत नहीं करते? दर्द नहीं होता? होगा। कल वंश विभाग में जाएंगे। सिस्टर की तरफ देखा। आज ही इनके बाल कटने चाहिए और दाढ़ी बननी चाहिए। यस सर। उसने पैड पर नोट किया। उन्होंने डॉक्टर नायडू से कहा, शो मी द बर्न्स। डॉक्टर नायडू ने दाई बाह की चादर हटाई। बाह टेढ़ी। डॉक्टर चारी ने हाथ पकड़ खींचा। बाह सीधी नहीं हुई। कंटेक्चर। ही may lose the use of right arm. Cut off his dead skin. बर्न्स कैसे आएंगे? अभी इन्हें खोल नहीं रहे। डॉक्टर चारी ने थोड़ी कठोरता से कहा, तब आप यहाँ आए। यस सर। बर्न्स के डॉक्टर, मनोरोग के डॉक्टर, दिल के विशेषज्ञ अपनी अपनी कोशिश कर रहे थे। कोई कुछ भी पूछता, कोई जवाब न देता। मेरा शब्दों पर से विश्वास उठ गया था। हाँ, बड़ी बहन कांता जब सुबह 8 बजे 3 बसें बदल कर पहुंचती तो उनके नमस्ते के जवाब जरूर देता। उसे देख सिकंदर हाक मारता, 8 बज गए, बहन जी आ गए, केले देंगे। कांता ने 4 केले उसके पास रखे। एक छीलकर मेरे मुंह के पास लाई। कसकर मुंह बंद कर लिया। सिकंदर ने अपना केला छीला, एक बार की गड़प कर गया। कांता, सिकंदर तू मेरा अच्छा बेटा है ना? बड़े भाई को भी केला खिला दो। सिकंदर, बड्डे साहब खा लो, ना तो बहन जी रोंगे। न, मैं सिर हिलाया। सिकंदर एकदम गुस्से में आ गया। नहीं खांदा? न खा। मैं भी नहीं खांदा। तू मर, मैं मर। उसने हाथ मार केले बिस्तर पर गिरा दिए। मुंह पर हाथ रख रोने लगा। मेरे अंदर कुछ हुआ। बाएं हाथ से उसकी ओर से छुआ। कहा, एक केला, बस एक। सिकंदर ने केला छीला, अपने हाथ से खिलाया। कोट पैंट टाई में लेटे शिमला वाले मरीज ने नारा लगाया, सिकंदर जिंदाबाद। कमरे में लेटो बैठो ने भी कहा, सिकंदर जिंदाबाद। सिकंदर ने बापू की तरफ देख कहा, बापू तेरा सिकंदर बहुत सियाना है, ठीक हो गया। ठीक। बड्डे साहब को केला खिला दिया। बापू ने उसके सिर पर हाथ फेरा। प्रोफेसर जी के भाग्य से तू भी ठीक हो जाएगा मेरे शेर पुत्र। इनकी सेवा करता रहे। कांता, भाई साहब नाई कहाँ बैठता है? काके के बाल कटवाने हैं। हरनाम सिंह, 10 बजे से पहले कटने चाहिए, डॉक्टर चारी गुस्सा करेंगे, मैं लाता हूँ। कांता, आपका तकलीफ? हरना, बहन जी मुझे भी थोड़ा पुण्य कमा लेने दो, गुरुजी की सेवा करूंगा तो मेरा सिकंदर ठीक हो जाएगा। आप तो सियानी है, सुना होगा, गुरु गोविंद देव खड़े काके लागू पाए। छोटे कद का नाई कमरे में आया, अंग अंग शरारत से भरा हुआ। सिर के बाल को देखा, कंधों तक लटके, दाढ़ी के बाल नाक को छूते। नाई, सरदार जी 100 रुपए लगेंगे। हरना, वीरा तय तो 25 हुए थे। नाई, 5 आदमियों के बाल है, कैची उस्तरा आधे ही रह जाएंगे। हरनाम ने बहन की तरफ देखा, उसने हाँ में सिर हिलाया। नाई ने एक और सिरहाना मेरे सिर के नीचे रखा। नाई, ब्यो आप जी बिल्कुल नहीं हिलना, अटेंशन लेते रहना। अच्छा बताओ, दिलीप कट की अमिताभ वैसे सजेगा? दिलीप कट देवदास वाला। बहन, आप बाल बिल्कुल छोटे कर दो। नाई, क्या नाराजगी हो गई बीबी, रोजी खाकर जाना पड़े? सफेद कपड़े से मुझे लपेटा, उछल कर 4 पाई की चारों ओर घूमता रहा। कपड़े पर बाल की लट्टे गिरने की आवाज आती रही। सिर हल्का लगने लगा। कैची चलती रही। सिकंदर, बड्डे साहब को बिल्कुल गंजा मत करना, फिर केले नहीं देंगे। नाई ने होठ पर उंगली रख चुप रहने को कहा। शायद सिर के बीच में बाल जचे नहीं। कैची चली।
Now to a text of a young doctor who started writing his memoir, aware that given the nature of cancer in his body, life would soon be unable to sustain him. The fragment here is of him considering the threshold of a not yet doctor, learning in the density of the labor room, finding sudden awareness that he was holding life in his hands.
Push, the nurse encouraged. Now again, just like that, only without the screaming. The screaming didn't stop and was soon accompanied by a gush of blood and other fluids. The neatness of medical diagrams did nothing to represent nature. red not only in tooth and claw, but in birth as well. And Anne Giddis' photo, this was not. It was becoming clear that learning to be a doctor in practice was going to be very different education from being a medical student in the classroom. Reading books and answering multiple choice questions bore little resemblance to taking action with its concomitant responsibility. Knowing you need to be judicious when pulling on the head to facilitate delivery of the shoulder is not the same as doing it. What if I pull too hard? Irreversible nerve injury is what my brain thought. The head appeared with each push and then retracted with each break. 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. I waited. The human brain has rendered the organism's most basic task, reproduction, a treacherous affair. That same brain made things like labor and delivery units, cardiotocometers, epidurals, and emergency C-sections both possible and necessary. I stood still, unsure when to act or what to do. The attending's voice guided my hands to the emerging head, and on the next push, I gently guided the baby's shoulders as she came out. She was large, plump, and wet, easily 3 times the size of the bird-like creatures from the previous night. Melissa clamped the cord and I cut it. The child's eyes opened and she began to cry. I held the baby a moment longer, feeling her weight and substance, then passed her to the nurse, who brought her to the mother.
Pickers also study the forest. They can name host trees, but tree classification only opens the door, determining the area a picker might search. It is not so helpful in actually finding mushrooms. Pickers do not waste much time looking up into trees. Our gaze is directed below where the mushrooms rise through the heaving earth. Some pickers mention that they pay attention to the dirt, favoring areas where the soil looks right. But when I press for specifications, they always demur. One picker was probably tired of my asking, so he explained. The right kind of soil is the soil where matsutake grows. So much for classification. Discourse has its limits here. Lifelines are entangled. Candy cane and matsutake, matsutake and its host trees and herbs, mosses, insects, soil bacteria, and forest animals. Heaving bumps and mushroom pickers. Matsutake pickers are alert to lifelines in the forest. Searching with all the senses creates this alertness. It is a form of forest knowledge and appreciation without the completeness of classification. Instead, searching brings us to the liveliness of being experienced as subjects rather than objects.
We conclude with a fragment from the memoir of a nurse about that which entwines us all. In another life, along with my many other career aspirations at school, I would have been a sonographer, but I don't study heart scans as a nurse. I watch the scans happening on the computer screen as a writer. The sensory experience of the sound of hearts, the beautiful colors of blue and red, oxygenated and unoxygenated blood. The patterns we all have inside us are the most beautiful landscape you can imagine. The movement of our blood flow, we dance inside. I carry with me the sound of the whoosh of the heart scan, as some people carry the sound of a drum beat from a favorite song. I remember beats. The smaller the baby, the faster and louder the whoosh. Babies gallop, race to live. A scan of a baby's heart reminds me that survival is instinctive, at birth perhaps more than ever. The will of a newborn, of species, of survival. We run towards life.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot to everyone for this lovely reading. So I'll invite Kush to respond.
Thank you. I think I wanted to give an applaud to the entire team, to Shveta, to Rachit, to Eesha. I'm going to name every one of you: Lohitha, Shravani, Gargi, Meeta, Vanshita, Tanisi, and I hope I haven't missed anybody, and Prasad. Thank you. Thank you for such a powerful, thoughtful, careful reading, reading in community, reading of texts. And I was listening to you and I was thinking to myself as to how does one respond to a collective reading? And I thought one way to respond to a collective reading would be to become one of the readers. And I will read an excerpt or two, and hopefully we'll sort of all come together to make sense of a number of things that that I have felt, that you have felt, that we have collectively invoked, but also hopefully invite others into a conversation as well. Assemblage thinking comes easily to trans folks, writes Hill Malatino. Most of us find Eurocentric myths of maximal agency, atomistic selfhood, and radical self-possession a really hard sell. We lack the privilege of having an uncomplicated I, and the ability to conjure oneself into such an I is always a product of privilege, to be sure. Recognition comes to us in the form of a gift. Though we tell others what pronouns to use, what names, how to refer to us, we're also thrown directly into a series of complicated relations as we attempt to infer how others are understanding their conferral of gender onto us. We come to gender as supplicants, all of us. And many of us fail the litmus test of decency because our modes of gender presentation are too vulgar, or gender fucked in such a way that we disrupt the natural attitude because we fail to enact and achieve a certain verisimilitude of normative white maleness or femaleness. Failing this litmus test means that we are repeatedly refused, turned away in moments of our imploring recognition. I'd wager that all trans people carry within them the memory of such refusals, even if they no longer actively shape our everyday engagements. This means that we all recognize gender as a morally loaded, laborious process. It is work, and our labor is alienated insofar as we don't own what we produce, and we rely on someone else to determine its value and worth. This means that we labor under conditions we don't choose, conditions that many of us actively want to destroy. But we also understand intimately that the concept of autonomy that underwrites romantic myths of insurrectionary subject can't hold. Gender recognition is sustained by a web of forces we don't control, but we rely on others for recognition. We understand how selfhood is given through such forms of recognition. Because when such a recognition is withheld, we intimately sense that we are being relegated to the position of the monstrous, simultaneously both more and less than human. Because we exert agency in determining our forms of life and flesh, but that agency is always only part of a much broader assembly into which our flesh and its possibility are grafted. So I'll pause here to place in the room the idea and the thought of an assemblage thinking. The other excerpt is a self-written messy note. It is an excerpt from a conversation which I've been having with myself ongoingly, and in relation to the different roles which I've inhabited in the past and those that I currently practice. And where I ask, how might we describe our relationship to research or to scholarship itself when it inhabits and grows out of a set of epistemic locations that feel less hostile to the process and experience of queer and trans becoming? The text and image, the community archive, the classroom. What do these locations index? And how might their overlaps and juxtapositions cumulatively through time expand the purpose of research or design or caring to ensure queer survival amidst heightened precarity and ongoing institutional violence? I'm currently facilitating a seminar on gender and technology and stewarding a lab on critical digital humanities. Each time I'm in these spaces, I'm emotionally full. I catch up with the lab and seminar members, quite like I'm catching up with many of you at SEA, but also connecting with many of you at SEA, who constitute a varied group. People with interests in social justice pedagogies, gender and computational systems, community histories, queer digital storytelling, and critical digital media. People who make critiques through games, through needlework, through academic writing, through teaching, through interactive storytelling. People with backgrounds in art, architecture, philosophy, English literature, journalism, visual arts, and engineering. People with Savarna merit, and a few exceptions outside this dominance. People moonlighting and death-laden, and all of them searching for protection from sexist, queerphobic, and transphobic hostility. We sit at the tables, we sit on floors, we occupy physical rooms, we occupy online rooms. We share poems, food, and extension cords. We piece together online collections, we haul zines and books, we install community libraries. We read Technology Will Not Save Us, and Why. I center a selection of footnotes and prototypes to help us consider what might constitute queer feminist restructurings of technological objects for anti-colonial conscientization and socio-technical reimaginings. We engage with queer and trans archives, games, and digital media as transnational, translocal, and transdisciplinary questions. We write and read quietly, messily, and often collaboratively. We stitch together biographies and bibliographies. We move at the speed of trust with Adrienne Marie Brown. I hold these written notes together and in conversation with each other to ask, how can we imagine and mobilize a relationship between power and knowledge in the context of gender and sexuality for dignity, justice, and everyday survival? Gayatri adds potted plants to the space one day. Ruthwig brings flowers as learning adjacencies on any given day. The space is expansively embodied. Other people join us. Our work is collective, interrelating scholarly and creative practices to name and align with a form of politics and presence that are otherwise disciplined, erased, or devalued in the academy. The lab stands transformed. I've always urged myself and my students to dream with citations, to think beyond known categorizations of queer selves, and to participate in the project of queer and trans liberation non-linearly, in community-centered ways, and as scholarship. This persistence to inquire historically, deeply, and relationally, without collapsing or diluting the origin points of knowing, is a form of stewardship, an epistemological frame that I draw upon and keep learning with Black and women of color trans feminist writings and intersectional care work, or what it means to care for something close to you. A frame which has enabled me to study how queer archives across difference have cared for objects and relationships that are dispersed. And a frame that keeps reminding me to scaffold both nimbly and carefully the worlds that femmes, queers, and trans bodies are futuring in and alongside the academy. If indeed being here, and here is also here with you, is an emotional and a political locus, and an ongoing care work to bring into being a bolder, accessible, and more affirming future for queer ways of knowing the world, where do we begin? So I wanted to pause there to sort of, again, respond with this question of not just where do we begin, but how do we come to the question of care? And each one of you and collectively have provided such unique both locations of thinking about care, but also shared with us connections that travel through time and raise questions of our collectivity in the now and for the future. So I'm really grateful and thankful for this really expansive reading, tying worlds, tying together bodies, tying together systems, experiences, to raise questions of not just our expertise as architects or designers or doctors or academics, but to also bring into view what the actual labor of care might feel like with the body, within the body. And so I think I'll just sort of also continue with a series of things that really stood out for me. And I was making a note, as I said to myself, to repeat and to sort of reread it towards the end. Forest and radioactive earth. Actually, I'm sorry, go back to when Sarda started with this idea of multiplying shared I, agile, agility, generous, generosity, generous reading. Custodianship, to attend to, temporality of care, Svalbard, global seed vault, main nahi uthungi, nahi to nahi. That was brilliant and such a powerful invitation to think about, again, our agency and place in the world. The capacity of the custodian to mark, to hold, to redistribute, to cast, to recast. Jahan and Jahapana, fort walls and step wells. The idea of care, to put things in perspective. Wilayat, dissidence, dissent. Author, authorship, refugee, refuge. Panha, to be drawn to. Body is real, what we think about it is fiction. Forest and radioactive earth. Body disclosing to one another, to another body, to attend, to become acutely aware of our opacity. Rajesh, diagnosis, supplementary diagnosis. Shunning support, concealments and disclosures, consequences and distribution, Sham Singh and the refugee colony, partition, migration, aberration, halos, on a halo of doctors, but also the work of anesthetics and anesthesia and an anesthetician. Hierarchies, the want to overcome these hierarchies, to not be chandeliers, but perhaps a lamp, to be part of a repetitive pattern of simple habits, to be a worker in community, in good health, and to support health. To care is to also note with anguish, to do the rounds in the ward. Ward, an important site, ward is a world. The right type of soil and entanglements. Lifelines are entangled. So I don't know how to respond, but just to say that I think if this were indeed an assemblage and a way of sort of thinking about what and how we experience through an assemblage of texts, ideas, memories, conversations, what does it mean to then participate in the world, collaborate with each other in and through an assemblage thinking, or to enact that thinking of the assemblage as we think of our own roles, whether as doctors, as architects, as readers, as writers, as students. Yeah, to draw attention to the body, but to draw attention to the body and how it becomes what it becomes in a context that each one of you also highlighted: historical, legal, medical, social. Yeah, I'll pause there because I want to perhaps in the spirit of a collective reading also perhaps have a collective conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Kush. That is so moving. This reading, to be listened to in this way and to be responded to in this way. It's really moving. I'm going to try and be with some of the ideas that you're saying, but one thing that I do want to say is that the thread that you've put, just to be with the thread that you've because of the thread that you've picked. There is this thing that I really like to do. I really like to cook, and I really like to cook and have a meal with others. And when you have to cook, you have to think of the ingredients, you have to think of what is available and what is there, and you have to attend to what the world is providing, what is there, what is available, what's in the season, what you can put together. And then when you sit down to have that meal together, when you cook it, you cook it with the care for what you are making and who you are making it for. And when you sit down to have a meal together, you would like for everyone who's eating to attend to the meal and not to eat it because they care for you. And this constant shifting that happens between what we attend to and what we care for, and what caring is and what to attend is one thing that comes into my mind. And the other is, well, maybe also as a scaffolding to care, to attend. But the other thing is to the assemblage that you're talking about. And there is one thought that I would like to propose, which is one of recomposition. I think of these texts as a recompositional, as a recompositional process. And what I mean by that is when we're reading, and we're reading over a long period of time, there's things that make you move in certain directions. Some of what you're talking about, for me, it was being outside of the cycle of production. And I was reading. And then over time, larger forces happen, which give a certain kind of anchors to some of the segments. And then in the last 3 or 4 years, for example, we have seen a certain kind of brutal way in which the city has been, not its incapacity to offer pana, and not only an incapacity to offer pana, but to actually eject people from the city. And then you start moving again. You move in the city, and though you have this in mind, suddenly you see the peer, the dargah of the peer. You see the life and the people who are around it. You see different nestings of refuge that are there. And then a figure appears to you from what you are reading, which makes something appear. And then once it's appeared, it won't go away. So it's a recompositional process that is ongoing. And I was thinking of that in listening to what you're saying, and I wanted to offer that back.
Thank you. Yes, that's so vivid and so descriptive and feels so real. The ability to sort of see attentively, and how it travels with you. That the capacity to see, and perhaps the capacity to also, or maybe the question is how to not lose this capacity to see. So if you're saying that the city is constantly becoming even more hostile to this idea of being a refuge, or of its capacity to offer panah, and yet in these very everyday moments, we still are able to find moments and places and spaces and nooks and corners that hold our attention and that allow us to hold ourselves. How to keep that alive, the ability to see when we see what we see, even though the very larger experience of inhabiting a city feels every day more and more alienating to the body, to our collective consciousness. So yeah, I think it's, I don't know if I'm making sense, but I think since we have students here in the room as well, this idea of what does it mean to inhabit with care, but also what does it mean to then continuously practice that inhabitation is something of interest to me. as I think with students too. So if anybody among the student group would like to respond.
So, hi. I've been, all throughout the presentation, the process that we went through, and while reading all of what we did, and through the really moving response from Kush, there is this understanding of care that extends its meaning, and it's the definition of care as it is, from more than the illnesses. It extends the idea of care to multiple narratives of state, space, of work, of simple acts of joy of life. While a very simple, something that really moved me while we were reading, while we were preparing to read with Shveta through the time we spent with her, was that there is a conscious act. And when I use the word conscious because, it also intends that that act is done with care. So the conscious act of collecting all these different narratives from so many stories that she has read over time, then putting them together, stringing them together in a certain order, carefully curating them to bring out a larger narrative of care, to bring out a story, to tell a story, then to read it carefully. And also like listening to others read parts of it. This whole acts of listening, acts of talking, acts of reading, acts of constructing that larger narrative, it not only increased or emphasized each of those texts individually for me, but created this larger understanding and expanded the whole meaning for me. Like when, for example, that Hatfield crash was a news article. It was a news article, and when I would have read it on a newspaper, it would have been that. But when I read it in the context of this presentation, my sense of care has increased. I think reading and simply listening to the whole presentation has made me care more, which I think was the biggest take back for me as a participant of this whole process.
Thank you, Rachit.
Thank you. Thanks. Go ahead, Prasad. Sorry.
No, Kush, go ahead. No, I just want to make an announcement. One is, for the attendees, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box, and we'll take them up in the order. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I was thanking Rachit and was also sort of going to invite the others to reflect or connect any of these ideas, the idea of composition, recomposition, anchors, segments. And I can't help but, because I've had conversations with SEA and community at SEA for a few years now, we keep returning to this idea of what feels as a refuge in a given moment in time does not always stay accessible, or we are not always able to access spaces of refuge, leave alone find spaces of refuge as we move in different directions through the world, and even attempt to build new worlds. And so to Shveta, your point, I think that's so powerful to me, because the larger system is structured to continuously work against this idea of enacting refuge. how do we, or what do we hold on to as individuals, as a collective, to continually build in whichever significant, insignificant, ordinary, extraordinary, daily, everyday ways, this ability to care and practice care, so that at no point it is about the halos or the idea of there was an interesting metaphor that one of the texts really brought out, which was I mean, it was there in Kiran Kumar's work, but there was something else that I wanted to really connect it to. But anyways, I think I'll come back to it. But just this idea of really feeling cared for whilst we are building structures and infrastructures of care is something that I'm grappling with. And it's part of my liberality as well, as much as I try and create that space with my students and with my trusted others, what does it mean to also feel cared for in that process? Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to jump in and into the conversation. I've attended this twice before, and there was something about today, just in terms of so this relay of readings that were happening from different places, and something to respond to the Kush in terms of this idea of so it sort of felt like there's this piece on the mushroom, which is like you're looking at this heap, right? And for me, it was almost like attending to this heap of the idea of care, so attending to this heap, which is of textures, right? Which is about a certain stubbornness of someone to not give in to, but also a refusal to, be handed over into the custody of someone, right? There's also a stubbornness of, patients not wanting to eat kelas, and then there is, there's this sense of stubbornness, but then also this vulnerability that is sort of mixed with it, right? A certain fragility that sort of appears with the stubbornness also, right? And what you say in terms of this idea of opacity, right? Which one is always so there's always a doubleness to the question of refuge or the idea of refuge or to any of these things, right? Where it's not necessarily, and that is what one is sort of attending to, that in terms of that heave. But it's also these lines that, this is people speaking from different places have brought, which is, the line of care that sort of extends from Syria all the way to the Arctic. From, from Delhi all the way to Bombay. So it's what Rachit was talking, there's an extension of care. These extensions are sort of lines that are being drawn across places and times, right? Which also needs some form of, attention, and all of this sort of starts appearing in the text that you sort of brought together, and it's sort of opened up, paths or a way in which one looks at care, which we haven't had so far, which is not, I mean, it's a very sensorial, vulnerable, sort of a draining, but at the same time an enriching way of looking at care, which it's like it brings up a question. I mean, for architects, like what does it mean to think about infrastructures of care? But it also requires all of this work to pay attention to that heap that you just sort of generated with all of these texts being brought together. So I just wanted to say that. I mean, it's something that comes up as you were speaking, and that's happened for the first time. Although I've heard you guys do this before. Yeah. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I don't know what to say right now. So please.
So there's someone who's wanted to sort of respond. So we have in the Q&A section, Nandini Nayak, who says that in my mind, I'm mulling over what has been and is being read. So I'm struck by allusion to the layers of opacity of carers and the world of wards. I'll allow these and other fragments to linger in my mind. Don't want to ask a question at the moment. My curiosity is really about the process of arrival at this work. And for students of architecture, how do you hear all of this? What does this mean for you? So take these as comments rather than questions. Yeah, but it's really a question for, in terms of to the students, but also to you, like the process of, of bringing to this, all of this together. So what does it mean for all of you to do this together? Yeah.
So about bringing it all together, like there's two parts to it, kind of, though they become connected. About bringing this all together, I offered an image of a tree without leaves, where you can see all the branches, and the reading and the thinking and the walking, and some fragments becoming, gaining some kind of a force or a velocity is all part of this tree, and then putting it together for this reader and for sharing with 8 readers first, and then with a larger group would be the squirrel that takes its line through the branches of that tree. I think more than that, beyond that, I'm not very sure how much more to say about than this, and then recomposition, this process of continuously doing this, where fragments kind of gain a certain kind of a force, and then they have to be brought into a relation with other things, because how you're seeing the city and how you're seeing the street and how you're seeing someone else changes when something appears, and then you come back to reading again, and then it goes on in that way. But the second part of it, of what it means for architecture students, if I would like for everybody to answer that, but I also want to add to it, or maybe sidestep it so that they can happen together. I also wanted to ask all of you what it was like in the months that you were stepping out with these readings, whether in the classroom or to a friend or in the family or to strangers or neighbors, because there was, for me to come and read with you was my stepping out with you and reading it. So what was it like for you in the last month of doing that? Or if any of you have anything to say about that.
So I just wanted to say that when they were asking how did this whole thing come up. So while you were reading this, and because you were reading this with our friends and like everybody, the other students who are my friends, the discussions that happened later sort, and because these were between friends and being read together, we were all in the same zone of thinking with care, listening with care, and then the discussions that followed were, related to this, and like, and then the premise of this whole series was about, how do we respond or think with care to the uncertainties that are happening around. So us being part of these uncertainties, and if we were ever to respond to anything that is uncertain, what would be like, instead of just being there or instead of just being present, how can we like think with care and through the sensitivity of all the work that we have, collected or read until now. Yeah, this is what is something that I'm taking with me.
I want to just, Eesha actually covered it all. But the small thing that, when in the question, uh, she has specified students of architecture as usme, my brain immediately went, that while we were in the process with Shveta and while we were reading the text and listening to it, I think we stepped out of that role of architecture while being in it simultaneously. We were more human, we were more part of the larger fabric in a sense, while being the architect. And if somebody asks me, how has this affected me, or how have I been influenced by the whole process and the reading, it's simply that, it has expanded and made me more aware and about the idea of care and how much importance it has in life, in a sense. So if someday, somehow I respond or I do anything as an architect, any work of mine or any engagement that I make with the world, I think the idea of care would always be present in it. I think that becomes a response as an architecture student.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm not saying this like as an architecture student, just like it's a very specific insight or an observation that was like for me was that I found myself pondering over this idea of being the receiver of care and also simultaneously like the giver of care. So, and the layers that come with being each of those things. And that was something that I thought about a lot throughout the like while being a receiver of care, the things that you feel, and while being the giver of care, the things that you that can feel, that can like like those layers, like the guilt or the vulnerability, and that is something that I'm still like processing from the text. So yeah, that was something that I can take away with me.
Continuing Shravani's idea, the idea of actually reading it to somebody and that somebody being a little more specific, as in you're reading it to your friend or are you reading it to yourself? So in so many cases, I was reading it aloud to my parents and they were also sitting along with me, trying to see what it actually means and what are the layers of it. And sort of to read it to people who care for me was another thing that opened up. And to also look at it with the idea of not just care, but then reading a certain piece that will allow you to sort of go forward with the idea of care in the sense that um, it's not just not just thinking, oh, I will care for somebody, but then also being very, very attentive to looking at whether somebody has, cared for you. So it's mostly like acknowledging things, basically. So that was what I was thinking of.
May I just sort of continue on this this thread of conversation. And Prasad, you bring in this dimension of care across geographical, temporal distinctions and lines of care. And I can't help but also go back to this whole collective reading that we all heard and experienced. How in so many of your voices, each one of you read in very unique ways. No two reading of the text, of course, is similar, but also what we heard, how we heard you talk about them, read through those nuances was so unique to you. And I found in the hour that we spent listening to you, in addition to lines of care, there were also different ways of understanding expertise of care, if I may. And so, whether it is the midwife, the anesthetics, individual in the room, the community health worker. There are just so many ways to start. The mushroom itself. I mean, I think there's a sense of, I know, intention and intentionality behind how and why these texts really start speaking to each other. But I think as we are also thinking of our roles, not just in terms of our professional expertise, it's about how do we inhabit these various dimensions and forms and practices of care that manifest themselves into literally creating shelters of different kinds. Again, sorry to bring up another architectural metaphor, but shelters writ broadly, understood broadly, refuge be understood more specifically, but also ongoingly. So yeah, I think the question of expertise is something that I really am thinking with, and I'm also hoping students are able to pick on it, because that is something that you're always asked to demonstrate, whether in architecture schools or as professionals. And so how do you move away from these very staid expectations of expertise to own a vocabulary and a practice of expertise that is actually building shelters for one, for all of us, and that construction of shelters, the idea of sheltering, is very, very exciting for me.
Just add, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just to go along with this, with what you have said, Prasad, and with what Kush has just said, that there is also the story of the seed and oil and minerals, which is moving along with this, both in the singularity of the seed and the refuge that it takes in the seed vault, to the soil and oil and minerals, all of which go to make us and help us, through which we do what we are, like the oil that we consume by eating, or the oil that we consume and that these are also threads that move through all of this.
Right. Yeah, I was actually thinking about the stubbornness of the rails and the stubbornness of not wanting to eat bananas, and sort of that being a part of the process of having to, I guess, do the rounds and take care of someone. Yeah. But I mean, I had a question actually for the students, which is, and actually also Shveta, which is, I mean, there's also a process of sort of speaking with each other or collectively, right? Where, I mean, there's a beat, but there's also, right, like, that in some ways you are waiting for the other person, sort of listening. Like, I was wondering what that process was for all of you. Did it sort of change over, the last 4 sessions that you've done, where you're not necessarily just looking at your text, right, what you have to read, but you're also starting to, you have to listen and sort of wait and, have a moment of knowing what the other person is doing. So does that also change for you, or did it change for you through, although you are friends, there's also this process of doing it, right?
Yeah, actually, when we had all those 4 sessions and we were reading, every time first I don't think I might have paid attention, but then as we went along, and then it can intensify the text. All of them, they say different things about refuge, about pana, and then care about how they are actually going along with it. So it's like every time the person reads, you get to know another aspect of what it's talking about, and then you just get into the text itself. So after that, like today when we were reading, I didn't actually have to be more attentive because I know what's going to happen now and then what's going to happen next. So it became a very interesting kind of a story for me itself, that it's going along and I'm going along with it. So
yeah,
it's very interesting in that, and also the aspect of care then automatically increases, as Rachit was saying, that it automatically extends to your friends, that listening carefully itself becomes one of the processes you go through.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. Basically, I was just thinking through everything that all of you all have said, and what stood out to me was this the idea of the assemblage and how it's basically able to hold in all of these ideas, and the proposal of the pana as a refuge, but then the refuge itself is kind of questioning, and within itself it's able to hold these multiple questions. And I think listening by extension becomes an act of asking questions in some sense when we were reading out to one another, and that itself produces or is a part of care in some sense. I'm not sure if I'm making sense right now, but it's that's something that just came to my mind, and something that have been thinking through whenever it is that we sat down to read the text together. Yeah.
Anyone else? No? Okay. Okay. I'll let me just okay, we don't have any questions, but it's there is there was one comment which was to just say that the whole thing was very mesmerizing. So it was it was a lovely experience just listening to it, and I wish it's sort of a recorded thing that one can listen to like over a period where every time you listen to it, and which is what has happened to me at least, is that every time I listen to it, like Vanshita was saying, there's this aspect of it that sort of opens up that you haven't really I guess paid attention to before. It was also strange because I was thinking of how do I introduce this, because I did introduce a speaker, but that's not what really is going on. It is in some sense sort of what you call a recompositional reading of text to construct a new sort of landscape of which has these textures of emotions of or it's such a dense landscape of a lot of things that sort of constitute what at this point I would think of as care, which is not necessarily very clear, but it sort of keeps changing every time you sort of read it and listen to it again and again. And I think it's something that at least for me will stay with me as I over the next days, but also I think as I start I know, like living. I mean, it's something that it brings a lot of things to your attention to start, thinking about. So thanks a lot for doing that for all of us. So thanks, Shveta, for doing this, for all the work, for putting the reader together, but also organizing and curating this reading. To all the students for participating and doing all the work despite your studios and everything, but giving it time and attention and sort of bringing all these texts to us in your own voices. And to Kush for responding and making my job easier. So thanks a lot, Kush. And to everyone who's, listening in to us. I know it's been maybe a long day, so thanks for staying with us and giving us time to listen to us. So thanks a lot. And I'll end the session. So this is the last session. We'll be back next semester with another SEACONVERSATIONS. So we'll put it up on our website. So thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks a lot again to all the speakers. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shveta. Yeah, hope this continues.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, like it had to be in person so that we could end this with some kind of, like you said, some food and some.
Yes, that would be great. And then we should have another session, which is like we eat, and then we do another session, which is 6 hours long, and we read together.
Yeah, I think they would love it too. Given the
love it. Yeah, but thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Everybody, thank you. Thank you so much. Ab chale gaye. See you, Prasad. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I'll put everything